If I haven't made you mad yet, maybe I will now. I don't know. We'll find out. This last topic, big topic that we're going to talk about here, is race. The Bible is packed with really challenging things to say on the issue of race. Racism was one of the very first issues to confront the early church in the book of Acts. Paul had to rebuke Peter because Peter was being racist and refusing to sit with Gentiles or non Jews when Jews were around. Paul writes, "But when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For he regularly ate with the Gentiles before certain men came from James. However, when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he feared those from the circumcision party. Then the rest of the Jews joined his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." So what that means is that when certain people were around, Peter would sit with Gentiles, non-Jews. And then when certain people showed up, Peter would be like, "Oh, no, I don't sit with those people. I only sit with you people over here." And Paul had to be like, "You stand condemned, sir. This is hypocrisy. Racism is what we would call it today." So, again, before we get any further, we need to define racism. I'm going to use Dr. Martin Luther King's definition of racism. I think that's a decent source for a definition of racism. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." So racism, according to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is judging someone according to the color of their skin, or the shape of their head or their nose, which is what the Nazis did with Jews and other non-Aryans. They had calipers and they had all this, so they'd measure everybody to try and figure out whether or not you were Aryan. And if they weren't, it went bad for you. So does that definition of racism, judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, is that a biblical definition? Because again, we're not here to look at Dr. King's definition and say, "I like that." We're here to ask the question, is it biblical? James, the brother of Jesus, wrote about favoritism. He says, "My brothers and sisters, do not show favoritism as you hold on to the faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. For if someone comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and a poor person dressed in filthy clothes also comes in, if you look with favor on the one wearing the fine clothes and say, 'Sit here in a good place,' and yet you say to the poor person, 'Stand over there,' or 'Sit here on the floor by my footstool,' haven't you made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" So obviously James is talking about rich and poor, but I would say it would apply to the color of skin, right? Certainly based on the thing I just read from Galatians. We could say that it applies to race, right? Paul literally called Peter out for doing this with the issue of race. And the interesting thing is that you cannot invert this principle, right? You can't reverse it. You can't put the shoe on the other foot. The principle doesn't permit that. So, my brothers and sisters, do not show favoritism as you hold on to the faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. For if someone comes into your meeting wearing no jewelry and dressed in filthy clothes, and a rich person dressed in fine clothes also comes in, if you look on with favor on the one wearing the filthy clothes and say, 'Sit here in a good place,' yet you say to the rich person, 'Stand over there,' or 'Sit here on the floor by my footstool,' haven't you made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" In other words, we're not supposed to look at the outward appearance, right? We're not supposed to look at rich. We're not supposed to look at poor. We're not supposed to look at black or white or red or yellow or whatever color. We're supposed to see human beings. We are not to show any favoritism. Paul says, "There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female, since you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." And then there is the book of Genesis. Personally, I have a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. There are a lot of people who love Jesus, who are going to heaven who do not have a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. And that does them some favors when it comes to science, but it doesn't do them any favors when it comes to philosophy, especially a philosophy of race. So if you're a follower of Jesus and you don't have a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, listen up. Charles Darwin developed his theory in his famous book, The Theory of Evolution. His famous book was titled On the Origin of Species. But the book's full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Oops. Darwin's theory of evolution created a whole new pseudoscience that quite literally resulted in the deaths of millions of people in places like Dachau and Auschwitz and our modern abattoir, Planned Parenthood. I'm going to quote now from an essay written by Michael Crichton. He wrote Jurassic Park. This pseudoscience was backed by Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Winston Churchill. It was approved by Supreme Court Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, who ruled in its favor. The famous names who supported it included Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, activist Margaret Sanger, botanist Luther Burbank, Leland Stanford, founder of Stanford University, the novelist H.G. Wells, the playwright George Bernard Shaw, and hundreds of others. Nobel Prize winners gave support. Research was backed by the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations. The Cold Springs Harbor Institute was built to carry out this research, but important work was also done at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins. Legislation to address the crisis was passed in states from New York to California. The theory was eugenics, and its history is so dreadful, and to those who were caught up in it, so embarrassing, that it is now rarely discussed. But it is a story that should be well known to every citizen, so that its horrors are not repeated. And the basic idea of eugenics was that some humans were more evolved than others. These were Darwin's favored races, and it was incumbent on these favored races to make sure that they dominated the unfavored races. This idea is disgusting, it is wicked, it is deadly, and it is unbiblical. Margaret Sanger, who was innocently described by Michael Crichton as an activist, she founded Planned Parenthood. Here are some of her best quotes. I accepted an invitation to talk to the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. I was escorted to the platform, was introduced, and began to speak. In the end, through simple illustrations, I believed I had accomplished my purpose. A dozen invitations to speak at similar groups were proffered. My favorite part about this quote is that she wrote it herself in her autobiography. Here's another thing she wrote. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. This brings us back to a literal interpretation of Genesis. If you hold a literal interpretation of Genesis, then you believe that God created the first man and the first woman in the Garden of Eden, which was located somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right about here. God then fashioned Eve out of Adam's rib. This means two things. First, it probably means they weren't white. The only reason why I say probably is because we don't know what UV exposure was like before the flood, and so we don't know what that effect that would have had on the quantity of melanin in their skin. But that doesn't matter because, secondly, a literal Adam and Eve, whatever color they were originally, makes the entire question of race totally irrelevant because there's only one race, the human race. We are created by God in His image, all of us. We can share blood, we can share organs, we can and we should have children together. We share a Savior. There is no difference between the whitest Norwegian and the blackest African. We are all one. That's one of the reasons why I prefer a literal interpretation of Genesis. It blows just a gaping hole in racism right at the beginning of the Bible. But racism, like so many sins, it's a kind of a hydra. You cut off one of its heads and a new one just sprouts in a different place. It used to be in America, those with dark skin, whatever their ethnicity, were pushed aside, made to quite literally sit in the back of the bus or stand. Today, we've got ourselves a new form of racism that I'm going to call neo-racism, and it does the opposite, right? So I talked earlier about you can't take that passage in the book of James about how you shouldn't favor rich over poor and say, well, this means that I can favor poor over rich. No, that's not the point. The point is don't favor, don't have favoritism. So I first encountered this neo-racism in college in the early 2000s. And interestingly enough, I did not encounter it on the campus of the really liberal university that I attended in North Carolina. Unfortunately, I encountered it at the church I was attending. A lot of white people attended this church. And for some reason, the leadership of this church, who were also all white, thought that all these white people worshiping God together was a really bad thing. They felt like they were failing in some way. They wanted diversity. They called this desire for diversity social justice. Now, the best way I have found to take a neo-racist is just to take whatever they say and invert it and see how bad it stinks. So you kind of put it back to the way it was originally and see how it goes. So would you ever say, this church is really great. We love God here. We love each other. We serve our community. But folks, we've got a big old problem. There are too many black people in this church. We need some white people. We're going to plant a church over there so that we can get some white people and be more diverse. That stinks. I mean, someone's going to take this out of context and just devastate me because it's so awful. But it stinks because it's just plain racist. You're just looking at the color of people's skin instead of just saying, wow, everybody here really loves God, and you don't give a hoot what their color is. Missionaries do not go to foreign lands to diversify the church. Paul did not long to go to Asia because there were too many Jews in the church in Jerusalem. No. Paul wanted to go to Asia because the people in Asia didn't know about Jesus, and he wanted to tell them about Jesus. And then you know what? When they learned about Jesus and the people of Asia formed churches in Asia, they were all Asian. Racism exists everywhere on planet Earth. But there's something uniquely American about this sort of hand-wringing that we're talking about for two reasons. First, we have more ethnic diversity than most other nations. Most other nations aren't nations of immigrants like we are. Most other nations are, well, people who've lived there for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And the second reason is that we have these gigantic categories for race, right? White, black. Those are huge categories. Red, brown, huge categories. The rest of the world, because they're not nations of immigrants, they are in fact people who lived there for thousands and thousands of years, they get a little bit more surgical with their racism. So the British and the French, for example, different races, have butchered each other for centuries. The British and the Irish are kind of still at each other's throats, but it was really violent as early as the 1990s. Africans have been committing genocide against different racial categories of Africans for years. The movie Hotel Rwanda is about some of this genocide and ethnic cleansing. And there's stuff in Kosovo. Like literally, if you look this up on the internet, like every place on planet Earth has experienced racism and horrible things about it. But for some reason, because we are a nation of immigrants here in America, we tend to think to ourselves that if our church doesn't reflect the census data for what the different colors are in our little suburb or in our little community or in our little city, that like Jim Crow is going to start cawing again, okay? But this just is not true. Again, going back to that church that I attended in North Carolina, one of the pastors was Irish. Another one was French. So if we're going to be racist, looking at the races of the pastors to say nothing about the people in the congregation who are probably German and Dutch and British and who knows what else, the church was wildly diverse. But because we have these giant categories, white, we don't see it, right? Because we are sometimes blinded by racism. We are looking at the color of the skin, white, and not the content of character. People who love God worship here. What they look like, who cares? Today, neo-racism is, it is everywhere. It is everywhere. In fact, I was talking with a friend, and I was trying to convince him to move to Indiana from where he lives because the cost of living is so much lower here than where he's living. And he said to me, he said, "No, I don't want to move to Indiana. There are too many white people." Let's apply the test and reverse that. "No, I don't want to live in Arizona. There are too many black people." Ooh, that is super ugly. President Joe Biden declared in his 2019 Democrat primary debate with Bernie Sanders, quote, "I commit that if I'm elected president and I have an opportunity to appoint someone to the courts, I'll appoint the first black woman to the Supreme Court. If I'm elected president, my cabinet and my administration will look like the country. And I commit that I will, in fact, pick a woman to be vice president. There are a number of women who are qualified to be president tomorrow. I would pick a woman to be my vice president." Let's invert it and give it the smell test. "I commit that if I'm elected president and I have an opportunity to appoint someone to the courts, I'll appoint a white man to the Supreme Court. If I'm elected president, my cabinet and my administration will look like the country, and I commit that I will in fact pick a white man to be vice president. There are a number of white men who are qualified to be president tomorrow. I would pick a white man to be my vice president." Sexism and racism, whichever order you want to put them in, masquerading as virtue. Neo-racism, just taking old-fashioned racism and inverting it, instead of favoring rich over poor, you favor poor over rich. Instead of favoring white over black, you favor black over white, or yellow over white, or black over yellow, or I don't know. I'm dazzled even trying to think about different combinations. Like, doing that at all is totally wicked. It is totally unbiblical. It devastates people. I had a buddy back in the day in college, and he got to study abroad in New Zealand. And New Zealand is also a nation with many, mostly immigrants, right? The Maori were the first people who lived in New Zealand. And then all kinds of immigrants came. Okay. And just like happened to the first people here in America, it was bad, right? Disease, oppression, murder, slaughter, all these things happened to the Maori, as happened to the first peoples here in the United States. And so they sought to put into place in New Zealand affirmative action laws. Affirmative action laws say so much of a percent of the people who work in your office or who attend your school have to be of a certain race. It's judging people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. They did this aggressively in an attempt to help the Maori people in New Zealand, and it backfired brutally. Because one of the things that happened is, well, it created, quite frankly, more racism. Because what happened is nobody would go to a Maori doctor anymore. Because you had no idea if that Maori doctor was a doctor because he was qualified and smart enough to be a doctor, or if he was a doctor because he was Maori and maybe he didn't quite know what he was doing and he'd cut the wrong thing, So it created racism. We should fight. And we should fight racism like this wherever it is, in our own hearts, in particular, in political leadership, in churches. And we should remember, I'm going to quote it again because I love it so much. "After this I looked, and around the throne of God there was a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language which no one could number, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb." That's awesome. We should vote for those who will implement laws based on the content of character, not the color of skin. This whole thing, I want to try and summarize all this. And what it comes down to is that when we vote, we should not vote for what we like. We should not vote for what makes us feel good or what makes us secure or what makes us prosperous. We should vote for that which is biblical. The challenge is that no candidate, no political party, no platform will ever align totally with the Bible. There will be compromise. Politics has been called the art of the possible. We have to balance pragmatism and idealism. Ideally, these are the policies I would like to see happen. Ideally, this is the moral character of the person that I would like to see represent those ideas. Pragmatically, these are the people who are running. One of them will be president. One of them will not be president. I have to make a choice. Both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are deeply, profoundly flawed people. They have both had affairs. They have both spoken crassly. They have both acted foolishly. They have both been wrong to the great detriment of millions. One of them will be president, and we must vote. Here's a final quote from Thomas Sowell. It's a long one, so I do apologize, but it's so good. He says, "Unbending moral standards may dichotomize the human race in such a way that virtually everyone is lumped together as sinners, losing all moral distinction between honorable, imperfect people and unprincipled perpetrators of moral horrors. In the early days of the Civil War, some leading abolitionists condemned Abraham Lincoln as being no better than a slaveholder and no more a defender of the Union than Jefferson Davis. Their 20th century counterparts have morally lumped together the wrongs in democratic countries with mass murder and terror under totalitarianism. You hear this from some people who say, oh, well, yeah, China lies, but so does the United States. And it's like, well, yes, I mean, that is true. The government of the United States tells lies, and that's bad, and the government of the United States ought not to tell lies. But also the government of the United States, doesn't imprison millions of Muslims in a concentration camp and use them as slave labor. Also, the government of the United States didn't have a one-child policy, which resulted in millions of baby girls being aborted. Also, the United States of America isn't a communist nation, which policies have killed 30 to 45 million of its own people. So that's what he's talking about there. Is just because the United States lies and the government of China lies does not mean these two things are the same. One of them is an honorable, imperfect nation, and the other is an unprincipled perpetrator of moral horror. Thomas Sowell goes on, rejection of a social optimum cannot mean that something better than this optimum will be achieved. It may mean that something far worse will result from a failure to recognize the inherent limitations of the situation. Limitations of knowledge, resources, and human beings. There are only really two candidates. I mean, you've got RFK in there, but only two of them have a chance of being president. So there's a limitation of human beings. Had the whole society, Thomas Sowell says, adopted the position of a few perfectionist abolitionists and refused to support Lincoln in the war against the Confederacy, the abolition of slavery would not have come sooner, but much later, if at all. Similar perfectionism among people of diverse political persuasions led to concerted efforts to bring down the troubled Weimar Republic. However morally satisfying it may have been to believe that nothing could be worse than the fall of the Weimar Republic, many of those who contributed to its downfall learned too late in Nazi concentration camps just how much worse things could be. I think a really good example of what he's talking about here, and I'm going to name a name, is John Piper. John Piper has He wrote extensive in 2016. I don't know where he's at now, but in 2016, he wrote extensive essays urging followers of Christ not to vote for Donald Trump. He took this position that Donald Trump was no better than Jefferson Davis, right? Abraham Lincoln was no better than the guy who became the head of the Confederacy, right? He lumped them together because Donald Trump is a profoundly morally flawed individual. And he didn't vote for him, and he urged many other followers of Jesus not to vote for him as well. But then the political issue that John Piper probably cares about most, because I really like John Piper and his teaching has helped me enormously, is abortion. John Piper has been fighting the pro-life fight his entire life and has done excellent work in that regard. Well, guess who the president was who got to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices who put an end to Roe versus Wade, returning the question of abortion to individual states and already saving millions of lives? Donald Trump. Doesn't mean Donald Trump is perfect. Doesn't mean I like Donald Trump especially. All it means is politics is the art of the possible. You have to balance pragmatism and idealism. Every time you vote, no matter who the candidates are, you are choosing the lesser of 2 evils. This election is no different.